Last year, I moved into a new house far from the city. My new job was work from home, so I had no reason to be in a clustered and expensive city anymore. For the first couple of months, I was enjoying everything about the place, especially being so far from other people. But one regular weekday afternoon, I got a knock at my door. This was actually the first time anyone had come up to my door since I moved in, so it caught me a little off guard. I went up and opened the door to a tall, middle-aged man. "How can I help you?" I smiled to be friendly, thinking he was probably a neighbor from down the street. But strangely, the first thing he did was lean to the side and look past me into my house. It was like he was trying to see who else was home. Weirded out by his behavior, I pulled the door in and blocked the way with my body. The man turned and walked away from the door. I stayed and watched him go all the way down the driveway and continue walking until he got to the street, where he got into a parked car and drove off. Without a doubt, that was the strangest encounter I'd ever had with someone up until that point, and I really had no idea how to even think about it. That night, I stayed home for dinner just to make sure the man didn't come back. I debated calling the police to put in a report, but I thought I'd sound stupid for doing that, just because some man came up to my door and did nothing. Around 9 p.m. I turned on the TV and tried to get myself more relaxed before trying to sleep. While I was on the couch, though, I heard a voice speaking outside. I quickly muted the TV and listened. It was muffled, but I could make out at least two separate people talking somewhere in the back of my yard. I ran up to the back window and opened the blinds. In the distance, I could see two figures walking across my backyard. One of them had a long tool or object in his hand, but the other one was too hard to see clearly. They walked between the trees in my yard until they reached the side of my house. I went over to the side window and tried to see where they went, but I lost track of them, and they had stopped talking. Suddenly, a loud knocking at my front door made me jump and sent chills through my body. I walked up, trying not to make any noise, and looked through the peephole. There was one man dressed in dark clothing and wearing a hat that covered his eyes. He had to be one of the men I'd just seen, but where was the other? "What do you want?" I yelled, figuring they likely already knew I was home, or maybe I'd scare them away. The man stayed on the doorstep, looked over at the side of my house, then looked back at the door. After a few seconds, the lack of response started to terrify me. I went back to the living room to get my phone and call the police, but was interrupted by a loud smashing sound, followed by another and another. I looked across the hall and saw a man hitting a shovel against the back door. He saw me and looked at me for a second, then ran away. I was so scared I hesitated on whether to call the police or try to find somewhere to hide. The best answer was obviously to do both, but my thoughts were interrupted again when I heard the side window getting hit. I got my phone and dialed 911 while the man continued to hit the window over and over. But just as the police picked up the phone, everything went quiet, and it stayed quiet until the police came. When they pulled in, I was surprised by a sudden commotion outside. It turned out to be the man at the door who had chosen not to leave, and after a closer look, it was the same man who'd come by earlier that day. Strangely, when the police detained him, he refused to say anything about the other man who was with him. He denied everything over and over, even though there were clear cracks and dents in the doors and windows. It was frustrating to listen to, and even weeks later, the man still refused to detail why he had come by my house twice that day, or who the other man was. Everything remains so unanswered that it still creeps me out to this day. Why was the man trying to break in so badly? And what purpose did the man at my doorstep serve to aid in the break-in? I moved away in the following months, and have since only been hoping that it wasn't me they were after, or are still after. I was using Craigslist to sell an office chair that I no longer wanted. It wasn't broken or damaged and was barely even used, but I just didn't need it anymore. It took a few days, but eventually, I got a message from a man who was interested in buying the chair. We had a short phone call, and he seemed like any other nice guy. He was willing to pay my asking price too, so everything seemed perfect. We set to meet at a local Walmart parking lot, which I opted for to keep it in a public setting. Come Friday afternoon, I called the man and let him know I was on my way, Then I drove down to Walmart and got there right on time. He said he drove a gray Honda Civic, which I realized was very generic and basically useless information. He knew which car I drove too, so I was hoping he'd see me at least and come over. But time ticked away and there was no sign of him. I sent a text, and a few minutes later I called, but now he wasn't picking up. I stayed in the lot for nearly an hour waiting for him to show, but as the sun was going down, I decided to just go home. For most of the drive, I was just annoyed and upset that I'd had to waste my time for absolutely no reason. But about halfway back I realized that a car had been behind me for a while. I got nervous about it, but once I pulled into my street, they turned away. After going inside and tossing my phone and stuff on the counter, I went back out to bring the chair inside. As I walked down my driveway, a car pulled up along the road and parked right in front of my house. I couldn't tell for sure, but it looked very similar to the car that had been behind me earlier. It was a dark red sedan, looking to be at least 15 years old with rust all around it. I quickly got my chair out of my car and went inside, closing the garage and locking all the doors. I peeked out the windows and watched as the car just sat right in front of my house, still running and everything. I checked my phone to see if the man had ever responded, and he still hadn't. That's when it all really started making me nervous. After another minute, I heard a car door open and close. I looked out the window again and saw a figure in dark clothing standing beside the car, but he was facing the house as if he was inspecting it. Once I saw that, I closed the blinds and dialed 911, explaining to the operator that a creepy man was outside my house and that I thought he followed me home. They sent an officer on their way and I thanked them, then hung up. I pushed the blind up slightly and checked out the window one more time. His car was still there, but the man was gone. I could feel my heartbeat getting faster as I went around to each window and looked. But it wasn't until I got to my back door that I saw the man again. He was standing inside my fenced backyard and was looking up at my house. I didn't know what he was doing, but it was really creeping me out. And all I could think was that at any moment he was going to try to break in. After a second, the man started walking to the side of my house. I went back to the front window to see if he was going back to his car, but he didn't reappear. Then I went around to every window again, trying to find him. But a few minutes later, the police showed up. The car was still parked outside my house, and the man was nowhere to be found. What's worse is that the car was completely empty, not having a single piece of paper or even a fingerprint anywhere inside or outside of it. It was apparently bought from a junkyard years ago, but that was the earliest record they had of it. The police were just as weirded out as I was, especially since the man just disappeared, leaving his car behind and showing no effort to break in. One thing we can say almost for certain is that it was likely the same man from earlier who had used an untraceable email and account and followed me from the Walmart parking lot to my house. It's been a couple of months since all of this, but I still worry. Why else would he have taken the time to inspect my house on all sides, if he wasn't planning on coming back any day now to finish whatever it was he came to do? This happened a couple of years back when I was 26. My single mother had just passed away, and as the only child, I was left with the decision to either sell her house or move into it. I was living in a really nasty apartment at the time because I couldn't afford much, and after much deliberation, I decided to move into the house. It was already paid off, so I would save a considerable amount of money by making the switch. My goal was to hopefully save up for a few years, get back on my feet, and then sell it to buy the house I really wanted. Once my lease was up at the apartment, I moved across town to my mother's house. It was part of a community of farmland owners, but in recent years, most of that land had stopped being used for farming, leaving only empty fields in its wake. The same was true for my mom's land. The house itself was a charming old barn-style home in the middle of a huge field, with only a small overgrown path leading to it. During my first week living there, I spent most of my time cleaning and organizing my belongings. One night, while I was busy tidying up, I heard a car approaching the house. Peering out the window, I saw an old pickup truck driving down the overgrown path. It struck me as strange. The only reason anyone would come out here would be to visit the house. As it neared the end of the path, the truck slowed to a stop. I could make out a male figure in the driver's seat, but the darkness obscured any details. They stayed there for a moment, the headlights casting long shadows across the field, before suddenly performing a three-point turn and driving away. At first I thought they might have just typed in the wrong address or something, but it felt creepy to see someone venture out here so late at night. A few days passed, and by then I had finished getting the house cleaned up and organized. On a Sunday night, I was staying up late watching TV and enjoying a home-cooked meal, when I heard it again. A familiar sound in the distance. A car driving toward the house. I looked out the window and saw that same pickup truck, this time with all its headlights off. Knowing it couldn't possibly be an accident, I felt a surge of worry. I quickly glanced at my phone. It was nearly 1 a.m. Why would anyone be coming here at such an hour? The truck pulled up to the front of the house and parked. A man got out and started walking toward the porch. My heart raced. I waited anxiously, but after a minute there was no doorbell or knock. Cautiously, I crept up to the front door and peeked through the peephole. There he was, standing on the porch, looking directly at the door. Terror gripped me as I realized he was contemplating something, his presence sending chills down my spine. Then just as abruptly, he turned around and hurried back to his truck, speeding away into the darkness. I was deeply unsettled and called the police to report the incident, but there wasn't much they could do. I went to bed that night with a gnawing anxiety that clung to me like a shadow. The next morning I woke up to what I thought was a knock at the door. It was just a single knock, but I shot up in bed. Glancing out the window, I was relieved to see that the truck was gone. Quietly, I left my bedroom and crept downstairs to see who it was. Just as I reached the top of the steps, I froze. The front door was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I listened. Moments later, I heard footsteps moving through the hallway below me. In a panic, I hid in the spare bedroom next to mine, dialing 911 as I held my breath. The footsteps grew louder as they climbed the stairs, going straight into the master bedroom. I could hear them rifling through my things, searching as if they were looking for something specific. I was too scared to speak to the officer on the phone, fearing the intruder would hear me, so I sat there silently, my pulse pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally moved back downstairs and I dared to peek out the window. My heart sank as I saw the man again. It was the same figure from before, walking through the backyard toward the field of tall grass, disappearing into the darkness beyond. The police arrived shortly after and searched the area for evidence, but my description of the man was all they had to go on. I couldn't shake the thought that he had been looking for something my mother had left behind. What if he knew she had passed and thought he could find something valuable? The horrifying realization set in. He had to have known I was home. What did he plan to do to me if I hadn't been hiding? Overwhelmed by fear, I made the decision to sell the house a month later. I couldn't bear the thought of him returning, lurking in the shadows, searching for something else, or worse. Even now, I still check every few months to see if there have been any reports of break-ins at that address, but it's been quiet since that night. Yet the memory lingers, a haunting reminder of what could have happened, a nightmare that I can never fully escape. When I was 21, I made the poor decision to move out of my parents' house before I could afford a place on my own. It was something I had planned out for months, searching for cheap apartments, potential roommates, and anything that could help me move out. For some reason, I prioritized moving out on my own over everything else. After what felt like an endless search, I found a post on Facebook about a room for rent in my area. It was a 2-bedroom house, and the owner was renting out the 2nd bedroom. I sent him a message on Facebook and got a reply within minutes. He asked a couple of questions and then sent over a document that looked like a huge list of rules for moving in. They were all simple things. Common sense, really. After agreeing to all the rules, he let me come over to look at the room that same day. When I got there, I was very surprised at how clean and well put together the place was. It looked like a model house, so perfectly decorated and furnished. The owner, Terry, was a little bit weird though. He was in his late 20s, but his personality and looks didn't match the pristine appearance of the house. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt and had a peculiar way of talking that set off alarms in my mind. Still, I was blinded by the possibility of moving out, so I ignored my gut feeling. A week later, I packed up a rental van with my stuff and drove it down to the house. When I walked inside, I was almost certain I'd walked into the wrong house. It was so empty, devoid of decorations or furniture except for an old, worn-out couch in the living room. It was a completely different place than the one I'd seen before. Terry was standing there, acting like nothing was different, talking my ear off about how excited he was to have a roommate. I asked about all the furniture and everything, but he just ignored my question and went straight to moving my stuff into the house. Being a little weirded out, I still moved in. Several weeks went by, and honestly, I rarely even saw Terry. He was always working and didn't get home until late at night. But about a month in, I started realizing that Terry had stopped coming home most nights. It was maybe once a week that I'd hear him stumble in around 2 or 3 in the morning. He'd linger downstairs for a while and then leave, vanishing again for another week or so. Part of me didn't care because I was happy to have the house to myself, but another part of me was deeply curious about what he was up to. I mean, he wanted me to move in so badly, but now he was hardly ever around. Then one night at 2 in the morning, weeks since I'd last seen Terry, I was jolted awake by frantic banging on my bedroom door. "Wake up!" His voice cut through the darkness like a knife. I rushed over, heart pounding. Terry stood in the doorway, drenched in sweat and wearing an expression of raw anger. "Do not leave your room!" he hissed in a harsh voice, then grabbed the door and ripped the handle out of my hand, slamming it shut. I stood there in shock, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I listened to him stomp downstairs. With my mind racing, I slowly opened the door and crept out into the hallway. After a few moments, I heard the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor and into the garage. My stomach dropped. I ran downstairs to see what was happening. A smear of mud and dirt trailed across the kitchen floor, leading up to the garage door. When I tried to open it, I found that he had somehow locked it from the inside. Panic gripped me. I realized it was best to remove myself from the situation entirely. I dashed out to my car, heart racing as I dialed the cops. When they arrived at the house, Terry was already gone, and the smears on the floor had been cleaned up, leaving behind only a haunting reminder of his presence. Days passed, filled with uncertainty and dread. The police investigation revealed that Terry was actually renting the house from someone else, which meant I had never legally moved in. All the documents he sent me and had me sign were fake. I could hardly believe it. Terry likely wasn't even his real name. As far as I know, he never showed back up after that night. I didn't know for sure what he was up to, but he was so adamant about me staying in my room that night. With him vanishing afterward, it was clear he had something terrible to hide. What really confuses me, though, is why he wanted me to move into the house and live with him so badly. I can't shake the feeling that he had some sort of dark plan for me, and I barely got out of there before I found out the hard way. Each time I replay that night in my mind, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. 3 years ago, I moved down a few states on the East Coast to a new city for work. I had no choice. The money wasn't enough to make the trip to see the place before committing. But since I was only renting, there wasn't too much risk in it, or so I thought. It was mid-September when the movers came, loading everything up and then dropping it off at the house. The landlord was nice enough to let them in to unload, as I wouldn't be arriving until the following week. On a Monday evening, I finally arrived and saw the house in person for the first time. It was a mess, boxes stacked everywhere and furniture strewn about. But the house itself was decent. The layout was interesting. It was a single story with the kitchen and living room on one side, and then a long hallway on the other side that led to the bedrooms and bathrooms. Since it was already late, I went to the master bedroom and started working on getting the bed put together. I was exhausted from the travel, so I shut off all the lights and went to sleep. I didn't have a clock set up yet, so I had no idea what time it was when I woke up to an odd sound. Initially, I thought it was just the house settling, but curiosity got the better of me and I felt compelled to investigate. I got up and walked over to the room door. As I got closer, though, I realized the sound was coming from somewhere down the hallway. I opened the door, and it stopped almost instantly. The hallway was pitch black, so I flicked on the light, but nothing was there. I slowly walked down and peered into the living room. Everything looked the same as it had earlier, but I turned on the lights and scanned the room just to be sure. That's when I noticed them. Lots of footprints scattered across the floor, weaving in and out between the boxes. I rationalized that they must have come from the movers, and with no other signs of anything amiss, I returned to the bedroom. But it took me a while to fall asleep again, my mind racing. Why had the sound stopped when I opened the door? I tried to convince myself it was just the house making noises, but no explanation satisfied me. When I finally drifted back to sleep, it felt like I only stayed asleep for a minute before a sudden thump jolted me awake, followed by footsteps running down the hallway. My eyes shot open and I looked over at my bedroom door. It was wide open. Panic surged through me as I glanced down and saw clear footprints on the floor, leading right up to my bed. I jumped up and hurried to see who was there, but by then, they were long gone. All that was left were scuffed prints, like a dark shadow that had fled in a hurry. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and called the police, locking myself in the bathroom until they arrived. When the police finally showed up, they oddly found no signs of a break-in aside from the footprints. My mind raced. Surely they must have gained access during the week before I arrived, but something still didn't sit right with me. After unpacking and checking each box, nothing seemed to be missing. I couldn't shake the unsettling thought of what they had been doing in my house. Why had they walked right up to my bed? And what was that thump I heard just before they ran away? The landlord was eager to allow me to break the contract and move out, as long as I didn't say anything about the break-in publicly. At the time, it sounded like he just didn't want anyone to be scared away from the house, fearing it would hurt his rental income. But now, in retrospect, I wondered if there was something more sinister at play. What if he knew something I didn't? The chilling idea took root in my mind. What else had happened in that house while I wasn't there, and who, or what, was really lurking in the shadows?